Hello and welcome to the last, but not least, the best maybe, session of LocalGov Drupal Week. And I'm delighted. I'm Will Callahan from LocalGov Drupal. I'm product lead. I'm slightly punch drunk because somebody's drilled through the water pipe outside our house. So I've got that going on in the background while we're doing this session. It's great to see you all. We're joined by Nichole and Jamie from Invuse. This session is called Using KPIs to Prove the Success of Your LocalGov Drupal website. And I'm particularly interested in this because I've been in charge of projects where the launch site is amazing, but over 6 months to a year, it just goes backwards. So I'm really intrigued how you actually stay on top of that and what you do to sort of safeguard the quality, really. So I'm really looking forward to this. Before we get cracking, though, I'm just going to take a second to thank our event sponsors. So Anatech holder development contract. Agile Collective was our previous dev team through alpha and beta phases, and they now hold our support on hosting contract. Thank you to both of you. Also to Big Blue Door, who are currently sponsoring Mark Honroy to work on our platform. Also to our council and supplier subscribers, of which Invuse is one, and our supporting partners. We're very grateful to you all. It's why we're here. It's why we can afford to do the things that we do. Very briefly on the Zoom front, I realised finally after saying it 4 times, there's a view button top right where you can change the view of what you see. So please do that if you need to. If you've got any questions, put them in the chat. This session is being recorded, so if you don't want to be on screen, turn your camera off, and please do turn your audio off. So without further ado, I'm not sure which one of you starting, Nichole or Jamie, but over to you.
Sorry, I was finding the mute button. Thanks, Will. We'll try and live up to your expectations. Now we know you're super interested on this one. Can you guys see my screen okay?
Yeah.
Cool. Perfect. So what we're going to talk through is, as Will teed up, using KPIs to prove the success of your LGD website. I will talk a little bit, but Nichole, who's joining me on the call, I hope, this is her first LGD webinar, so please be kind. And she's going to lead on a lot of this because she's the one who implements this basically with her team. So yeah, what you'll get from this presentation is we're going to talk about how to set KPIs, basically how to measure those at each stage of the life cycle. So public beta, launch, and then continuous improvement after launch. How to avoid the common KPI traps that we see quite a lot of people fall into, and a simple repeatable framework for discovery, beta, and live. And then we'll give you a few real LGD examples and KPIs that we've used on our projects, and then a glimpse into kind of the toolkit that we apply with all of our customers. So to start with, I think it's probably worth teeing up the challenge, which won't be anything new to anyone here. But every council we've worked with, whether it's county, borough, district, etc., everyone has different challenges, but a lot of them always fall into these 5 buckets. So there's rising expectations. There's always the do more with less. There's always limited capacity. So small teams having to deliver for large audiences. There's hard to show value about KPIs. So how do you demonstrate the website is successful? It was worth the initial investment to SLT if you're not actually measuring that. We see a lot of councils not even think about taking baseline testing to start with to be able to measure against. So how can you prove progress or success if you're not measuring against any baseline to start with? But also another big challenge that we all face is the complex end-to-end journeys. We know the websites might be working, but a lot of the services like planning application, etc., which link off to planning portal and then into uniform, etc., we can only control what's in our power, which is the website. So we'll take you through how some of the KPIs we use, which are focused on the website, but also identify opportunities to work with third-party suppliers to actually improve the end-to-end journeys as well. Nichole.
All right, so that's kind of the overview of the challenge around KPIs. So let's talk a little bit about success criteria and KPIs themselves. So a really critical point here is that you can't measure success unless you define it first. So in order to do that, you're going to want to start with your success criteria, and that is a clear statement of the outcome you want to achieve. So this is really defining what good looks like. A good example of this would be residents reporting a missed bin easily and complete the journey without needing to call the council. So that's your success criteria. Once you have that, you can then define your key performance indicator, your KPI, and that is going to be a measurable metric that shows whether the success criteria have been met. So example of that, average time to complete the missed bin form is 1 minute, 20 seconds using 4 to 6 clicks across 10 users testing. And when you combine those, you get your meaningful measurement. So that's your clear evidence that the website is delivering the outcome you set out to achieve. For example, that would be time to complete missed bin form improved from 2 minutes and 50 seconds at your baseline to 1 minute and 20 seconds after launch. This means that residents are able to complete that form quickly, easily, more confidently, and gives you a 53% overall time reduction. That's kind of a high level what your KPIs are going to look like and how you'll set those meaningful measurements. So what are KPIs and what are they not? So a KPI should tell you whether your website is genuinely working for residents and staff. So they need to be measurable, repeatable indicators that show whether success criteria are being met. They're also a really great tool for prioritizing improvements, identifying any friction points, testing changes, and demonstrating wider impact. KPIs are not just page views and bounce rates or those vanity metrics. That data can be really interesting, but alone, it doesn't tell you whether a resident completed what they actually came to do. So yeah, a lot of these are useful and kind of pull into the wider KPI, but alone, they're just not enough. It's really critical that every KPI should help connect you to your user needs or help you make decisions or act on something. So the KPI lifecycle. KPIs are going to evolve throughout the project and the website. They're not something that you just set and forget. I'm going to give a high-level overview of kind of how it works at each phase of the project, but we will go into this later in more detail as well. So discovery is really where you're defining your user needs and agreeing on what success looks like. It's also where you're taking kind of that baseline measurement, getting all that baseline data. Alpha is where you test assumptions and shape those early KPIs. Beta is where you benchmark journeys and set measurable targets. Live is where you track performance and evaluate impact over a period of time. And then continuous improvement is where you're using that data over time to make kind of real improvements and impact and refine your services. So the really key takeaway here is that as you learn more about your residents and services, your KPIs are going to mature. So they're always going to be growing and evolving. In terms of types of KPIs, there's kind of 5 major ones. The first would be user experience. So that's things like average time to complete task, number of clicks, success rates. You also have content effectiveness. So that brings in things like reading age, percentage of people finding the information they need at the right time, search refinement rates, things like that. We also have accessibility inclusion. So WCAG compliance is a big one here. Number of accessibility issues per page, successful use of assistive technology to use the website, and navigation, keyboard navigation only, navigation kind of pass rates there. In terms of operational and service, this could include things like reduction in avoidable calls and emails, increase in self-service, reducing staff handling time, or kind of fewer complaints, escalations about the website or the digital services. And then kind of underpinning all of those, we have technical performance and engineering quality. And this really should be kind of the bare minimum here. We need to have, that page load speed, error and broken link volume, uptime availability, test coverage, security, carbon impact per page load. That's kind of really going to underpin everything else for your KPIs.
Yeah, and then so in terms of how to define good KPIs, every time we start a project, there's always over 20 to 30, sometimes even 50 in some project KPIs that we think we want to measure. But what we typically try to do is look at the data that's actually available, because some of the KPIs you can see on the screen here may not be achievable because you may not have that data to hand. So what you'll see is some of the examples on the screen are kind of ideal world, but we understand some councils don't have that level of data. So what we do is work with the data we have, the data we can gather in discovery, and then you'll see in a moment how we prioritize the KPIs. But what we fundamentally believe is good KPIs always start with a user need, and they always end with a measurable, realistic target. So for example, here, a resident applying for a parking permit, the success criteria would be a resident needs to complete the parking permit application on first attempt without dropping off the website or calling the council. The KPI to measure this would be tracking the task drop-off rates during the parking permit journey, and a realistic target based on the projects that we've done. We've worked on about 16 LGD projects. We would say a realistic target for this type of KPI would be to reduce the drop-off rate by 20% in the first 6 months after go live. Similar to this, we've worked on a lot of local offer sites and other websites. And if we're looking at Send, for example, for a parent to be able to check if my child's eligible for an EHCP, the success criteria is that they're easily able to understand the eligibility without needing to phone the Send helpline. The KPI would be number of Send helpline calls on a monthly basis about the eligibility, and the target we typically go with our customers is to reduce the calls regarding eligibility by 15% within the first 6 months. And then another one which we hear a lot is applying for discretionary housing payments. So again, the success criteria would be that a resident can successfully complete the DHP application with the correct amount of forms the first time round. The KPI would be that the percentage of DHP applications submitted with all required evidence is on the first attempt, and an increase for us is that the completion rate with all of the evidence in the first 6 months should increase by 65%. So it's just 3 different types of KPIs. The first one's looking at completions, the second one's looking at call volumes, and the third one's looking at successful applications. But it's just to show that KPIs aren't always just based on the user journey. They can be measured in a variety of ways. And in terms of how to choose the right KPIs, everything, it's quite easy when you're working on a website project or an LGD project specifically to start your KPIs at website level. But what we always encourage our council customers to do is think about the corporate strategy and the vision of the council first. And then we have almost like an OKR approach where it filters down from the very top. So for example, a lot of corporate strategies for councils is to increase digital inclusion, to ensure all residents can access online services regardless of ability. You might get some which is improving resident experience. So the KPI to track for this would be around reducing avoidable contact to free up staff for complex cases. It may be, we've seen a couple of our customers, one of their focuses is on supporting vulnerable residents. So we then have a KPI that looks at improving access to early help, safeguarding and financial support services. And then most recently, we've started to see a few more strategies around climate and net zero commitments. So we'd encourage when we're going through the KPI filtering process to have a KPI around reduction in CO2 on pages. But again, like we've said on other slides, it always starts with a user behavior. So identify journeys that generate the highest avoidable contact. So we usually use analytics to identify which journeys are being used the most. We then look at the service volume and failure demand. So we then prioritize those based on the number of calls or number of emails that each service area or the service desk is getting. Then we look at the operational costs, and for many, it's quite hard to calculate how much money it's actually costing for calls, but there's baseline metrics that we use and are published online, we'll come on to in a second, which allow us to identify which area of a council is actually costing them the most money, because the priority every year for the council is always reduce your costs. And that's how we kind of tie in a user experience KPI into the cost factor. And then finally, we can look at as much data, research, and statistics in terms of costs, but you need to speak to the people that are actually dealing with this, because if all of the data points to a lot of calls coming in for EHCP eligibility, for example, and you speak to the SMEs who say actually the calls aren't about eligibility, most of the calls are about something else, then we have kind of a redundant KPI. So what we're trying to say here is we use analytics, we combine that with failure demand, we then look at the cost, but then finally we validate everything we do with the SME that's responsible for this area, like the service lead, before confirming what a KPI is. In terms of how we help prioritize KPIs, we use a prioritization funnel, which looks like this. Won't talk through every step, but basically the very top of the funnel is always the corporate strategy. What are we trying to achieve as a council overall? Then what you put into the funnel after that is the user behaviors. So we start to make a list of the most visited tasks and high intention journeys, the drop-offs, the repeated searches, the friction points. Once you have that, you then add to the mix the highest application of forms, incorrect or incomplete submissions, and avoidable contact calls and emails to the service desk from poor kind of journeys and content. And then you add the operational impact, like I said, looking at the cost per call, cost per area. And then finally, you do that SME alignment to validate, is this actually the issue that's causing you the most time, the most money? And at the end of that funneling process, you'll probably come up with a list of between 20 and 30 KPIs that you could measure. And I think it's also important, as you're all probably aware, that SMEs will always say their KPIs are the most important. It's like the age-old argument of what should be on the homepage on a website or an intranet. Everyone thinks their area is the most important. So it's important that once you've done the prioritization funnel, you then go through kind of a scoring matrix. And the way that looks is how we use it is something like this. So we base it on 4 areas, which is obviously volume, failure, demand, cost to serve, and strategic value. And then we try and categorize it into 5 buckets, which then gives us a total score at the end of it, which we then usually take between 8 to 12 KPIs per implementation to measure initially. So for example, if call volumes in a particular area are above 15,000 a month, that's a very high score. So you get 5 points. If they're between 8,000 and 14,999, you get 4 points, 3 points for medium, 2 points for low, 1 point for very low. Same with failure demand. If we can see, a number of calls that could be avoided are over 1,000, it's a higher score, and so on and so forth. Cost to serve, if it costs 10 minutes on average per call, then we know it's very high, which is a significantly high number. And then it works its way down. And then finally, strategic value, how does it align to the corporate strategy? And again, that gives you a scoring matrix. And now we're taking our 20 to 30 KPIs that we started with, putting them through a scoring matrix. And then what we eventually come to is something like this. So we apply the scoring matrix and it reveals kind of the top 8 to 10, and in some cases 12 KPIs that we've now spoken to all of the service leads. We've now looked at the analytics. We've looked at the service data where available. And now we've got our scoring matrix, which told us what the top 8 to 12 KPIs that we should be measuring. And then this is what determines collaboratively with the council in the scope and planning workshops at the beginning of a project, ahead of kind of public beta. This stuff here kind of helps us also define if we go with a phased rollout, so a public beta, a private beta sometimes, then we will know what service areas we need to focus on most, because the ones which have the highest priority in the KPIs are usually the service areas that we would launch as part of that beta phase. Because typically some of our rollouts include 3 service areas followed by another 3 rather than just a big bang. And so the KPI model also helps us determine which service area should go in which order. In terms of how we measure KPIs, there's a number of ways and there's a number of tools that every council has subscriptions for and some councils don't. But high level, before we go into the tools, we use a number of different techniques. And I say we, Nichole primarily, but also backed by our innovation team. So we have analytics and behavioral data that's using things like GA4 or Matomo. Most recently, we started to explore Microsoft Clarity as well, which offers that heat mapping and screen recording capabilities. We do a lot of direct user testing, and I think it's important that we emphasize that the best KPI measurements and the best way to measure KPIs is always to include a combination of automation and direct user testing, because those that are constantly calling the council or the older demographics, they're not using the website and then they're unlikely to use the website. So making sure you reach the minority audiences for a council is also important. And the only way we really find to do that is to go and do things like guerrilla testing in civic offices or in libraries or in supermarkets in some cases. So we always combine the kind of analytical data with direct user testing. We then look at service and operational insights. Now, not all councils actually record how many calls and emails they get, but the ones that do, we're able to tap into this data. The ones that don't, we can work with them to kind of gauge an average. And then finally is technical performance and reliability. So this really sits with our tech ops team, but making sure that we have all of the reporting systems in place to be able to measure page reporting, page loading time, be able to measure search performance and all of that kind of stuff. So they're the 4 ways we primarily gather data, and it comes into a big kind of pot, which we then use to measure success. And then to like bring Nichole's going to go through a few examples that we've actually delivered with customers on LGD, but just to give you an example of bringing one to life. So a success criteria for, as Nichole touched on a minute ago, residents can report a missed bin and complete the journey without needing to call the council. And then the average time is what we use on this particular KPI. And then a meaningful outcome would be able to calculate the percentage that it's reduced by and be able to demonstrate to SLT, to the service leads, that this is the score we've been able to achieve. And then finally, before I hand back to Nichole, the KPI traps are a thing. We're all aware of them, but there's so many different ways to fail on KPIs. A lot of councils get started and then feel overwhelmed, or some just don't see it as a priority anymore, but others just don't have the capacity to be able to track them over a long term. But the 5 areas that we find the traps are: there's too many KPIs. We advise so much to only do between 8 and 12, but we have worked on some projects which has 21, 22. And what tends to happen is the service leads responsible for those KPIs, or the ones that are interested in those, seem to lose focus eventually, or lose interest. And so those KPIs eventually whittle down to around 16, 17, and eventually down to single digits. So setting too many KPIs makes it very hard to measure. Then you have KPIs that show activity but not impact. So tracking things like page views, or number of published pages, or drop-off rates, that kind of stuff. It's useful for certain audiences, but really KPIs should be evidence-based for resident benefits, or staff efficiencies, or reduced cost to serve. So focusing on the kind of the page views or the website traffic, we wouldn't really define that as a KPI, more like a useful metric to have. KPIs are no action attached. So KPIs that are collected but never drive any kind of decisions or improvements. They're never used to formulate your roadmap or make changes to the website. So the way we kind of work with customers to fix this is to assign an owner, assign an action and cadence to each KPI. So we measure, we can easily measure and identify if there's any need for intervention. For KPIs chosen for the wrong reasons, so KPIs selected because they're easy to measure or politically attractive. We see this all the time. And the fix is what we've been through on the last slide. Use the data and research available to you. So look at the user need, look at the service volumes, failure demand, and the cost. And that will give you a real indicator of whether or not you're tracking the right KPIs. And then finally, one that we often fall into is unrealistic versus ambitious. So setting targets that are ridiculously unrealistic and setting targets that are ambitious, there's a fine line between that. So for example, if a key user journey to report an overgrown hedge, for example, currently takes 14 clicks, and we want to get that down to 2 clicks, it's unreasonable. But there's ways around it, because some would argue you can put a banner on a homepage. But really, we should be setting our targets based on baseline performance. How does it currently perform today? If we're going to cut from 16 clicks to 2, that's quite a dramatic jump. Maybe we should do that over iterations. Benchmark from other councils. So we do this with some of our customers. We look at their local 4 councils, their neighboring 4 councils around them. And we do user testing on their websites as well. And then we give them a comparison to how they're performing. Usability testing evidence. So that's the human intervention from Nichole and her team, where we actually go in and say, here's where it's currently at. If we're going to set a target for 2, it's likely to be unrealistic. And then we look at realistic staff capability and capacity. What's the impact of adding a banner to your homepage to reduce it to 2 click going to have on the rest of the website?
All right, so we've kind of gone through KPIs, what they look like, what they are, but how does this actually work in real life on a project? So like I said before you can measure success, you have to define it. So what you're going to need from your discovery phase is starting with that baseline analytic data. So you want to gather that baseline information on kind of page views, bounce rates, any journey tracking that you might already have, just to give you an idea of how your users are currently using the website. Then you're going to move into gathering baseline operational data from services. So that'll be stakeholder engagement, speak with the different services, and really understand kind of their feedback and what they're hearing from residents. You're going to want to collect call volumes, email volumes, form submissions, staff handling time, complaints, any kind of avoidable contact information about that. And if you can get at least 3 to 6 months of the kind of current state performance for all of those metrics, that's going to give you a good baseline to then compare against later. You're going to use kind of your first 2 steps to then create and define your priority user journeys. So you can have as many as feel relevant, but we recommend having at least a top 5 to 8 for future user testing, which I'll come on to in a moment. For each of those user journeys, you're going to want to define the success criteria. So example, residents can renew a parking permit quickly without needing support. That's going to be your criteria. You'll then set up GA4 or whatever analytic platform you're using, tracking, event campaign tracking for those key journeys. So you'll implement events for kind of the starting the task, completing the task, any errors, drop off, search refinements, any clicks on unique page elements, things like that. Then you can ensure that each event has a unique name tied to the service. And that way it's easy to kind of track it back over time. once you have that initial data and your priority journeys, I recommend kind of picking, again, those top 5 to 8, and then testing those in a baseline usability test with real users. So this will allow you to capture task success, time on task, ease of use, and then page and number of pages viewed and clicks during a task. And this is really critical because this allows kind of conducting this at baseline allows you to then compare after launch. And we also recommend here testing with participants who use assistive technology to really just get that additional insight into the accessibility of the site. And once you do that, we also recommend conducting a targeted user experience survey. So this is just to capture kind of a baseline of self-reported data about user satisfaction, task completion, and overall user experience, which you can then again compare after launch. So now you have all your baselines set. Moving into public beta and what that would look like. This is really kind of where your early evidence is going to start to take shape. So you'll have a few services live, which gives you a chance to review that data, refine your KPIs, and then make sure you're setting realistic targets moving forward. So you're going to want to focus on those KPIs that are aligned with the services that are live. You'll use real user behavior to refine your KPIs. So that is looking at analytic data, task start and finish, drop off, time on task, and comparing that to early discovery baselines. You're also going to want to validate these KPIs with operational insight. So review call volumes, complaints, any of that information you're getting from your services, and just compare that again to the baseline. This should help you identify where digital journeys are kind of reducing or failing to reduce any of that avoidable contact. And we also want to use this to then identify your early improvement opportunities. If there's anything kind of coming out that's hinting to content issues, design, friction, anything unclear, that's kind of what you want to prioritize fixing that before you move forward to launch. And then finally, this will help you set your launch performance targets based on real evidence. So use all of that data, make sure you're setting kind of achievable KPIs. And we recommend, again, agreeing these targets with the services just to make sure that everything's kind of clear, open communication, and shared ownership there as well. So once you've launched the website and the site is live, the first 6 months are going to give you kind of that earliest real world data. So this is when you're going to start to validate that the site is performing better than the old one and capture your first meaningful benchmarks. So you can start this by conducting a benchmark usability test. So this is going to be repeating the same tasks and scenarios and metrics that you tested in baseline, and you can then compare those results directly to quantify improvements. Again, repeat your user experience survey. So this is going to let you compare pre-launch results with like a like-for-like benchmark after launch. Review early analytics data. This will help you identify any friction points or changes in user behavior. You're then going to want to review operational data from services. Again, monitoring those call volumes, contact, and any kind of complaints or handling time. And this will help you check whether digital improvements are reducing service demand and flag any areas that maybe still need to be refined a little bit. And then collecting that early user feedback. So there's an opportunity here to use kind of one-page widgets or short feedback forms, things like, was this helpful, to help you catch any issues that didn't come up during usability testing. So once you have your first benchmark, you're going to move into continuous improvements. So KPIs are going to be that ongoing feedback loop. It's really critical to monitor them regularly. This helps you spot any friction, optimize those high demand services, and demonstrate your ongoing impact. So you'll start with tracking your KPIs on a regular cadence. We recommend typically monthly or quarterly, kind of depending on the service demand, focusing on task success, time on task, drop-offs, things like that. You're going to want to investigate any changes in performance. So use analytics and operational data to pick up any changes or potentially kind of trends that you're seeing. And this also can help give you some insight into what's kind of causing any changes, if it's negative or positive as well. You'll then want to prioritize improvements based on evidence. So fix issues that are generating kind of avoidable calls or complaints first, as well as address any gaps or unclear steps or any accessibility issues. So any of those kind of really critical issues, make sure you're addressing them as quickly as possible. We recommend also testing any of those major changes before going live. So make sure you're validating this with your frontline staff and user testing, and then remeasuring task performance after you've made changes. And finally, just feed that data back into service roadmaps. So make sure you're using insights to plan improvements collaboratively with staff. And this is a great opportunity to demonstrate impact and share wins with SLT and stakeholders. So that was kind of how to use them. What does this look like in real life? So when we worked with Woking Borough Council, they had a lot of complaints initially about the usability and overall UX of their website. So we defined the success criteria to improve overall user sentiment and reduce frustration. This KPI became an increased percent of users who self-report a positive or very positive overall experience when asked to rate their experience using the website. And our meaningful outcome we measured at beta, positive ratings had more than doubled. So they've gone from 27% to 60%, and negative ratings dropped from 40% to 0%, which is very, very exciting. Another great example, Essex County Council needed to upgrade their school's InfoLink site based on user feedback. So they had a few different KPIs: streamline content, improve user journey times, and raise compliance quality of information. This led us to create 3 KPIs: reduction in total page count, reduction in average user journey times, and reduction in non-compliance with WCAG. So our meaningful outcomes here, we compared at launch. The page count was reduced by 21%. To complete 4 critical journeys, the time taken was reduced by 38%. And compliance issues resolved rose by 66% as well. And finally, we have Haringey. Here we were working to streamline user journeys, simplify content, and ensure full accessibility compliance. So our KPIs here were percent reduction in content pages, average time to complete key tasks, self-service journeys reduced, and accessibility compliance score. Here we had content reduced by 30%. And then they had a few different key user journeys that they were measuring. So the first was reporting a missed bin collection, and that was reduced by 2 minutes and 34 seconds. They then measured the time taken to apply for discretionary housing payment, and that was reduced by 1 minute and 35 seconds. Finding your council tax band was reduced by 2 minutes and 8 seconds. And then find the price for a visitor parking permit was reduced by 49 seconds. So an average was about 2 minutes, and WCAG 2.2 AA compliance as well.
Awesome. And in terms of like tools and methods for tracking KPIs, every council uses different types of software. But typically the ones we see across technical performance, if hosted on AWS, is CloudWatch, but we've also got customers that use Pingdom and Screaming Frog. But any kind of technical, your LGD supplier will have their own alerts out for this. In terms of operational and service, looking at form submissions, or drop-offs, you can look at Granicus, FirmStep. And when you're looking at that call and email data, Freshdesk, Zendesk, ServiceNow, those are the kind of platforms where you can gather this data from. Analytics, obviously Google Analytics, Matomo, and as I said, most recently we've seen a really strong uptake in Microsoft Clarity. Typically, most councils use SilkTide, ReSite.me, Site Improve. User feedback in terms of this is the direct face-to-face user testing we use for unmoderated and moderated user research, includes tools like UX Tweak and Optimal Workshop, Smart Survey, obviously for surveys. And then the bit that we see often is forgotten about or people struggle with is the visualization of the KPIs. So typically what can be used for this is things like Power BI, Tableau, but also you could look at ways to integrate this into an LGD admin screen, which is what we've been working on recently, which makes things a lot easier. But I think the biggest learning from our work anyway is that all of these different KPIs and all of the KPIs that come out of your priorities, your funnel, and then your scoring matrix, they're all controlled and hosted in different places and reported by different tools. So often it becomes a bit of a minefield to understand how you can actually bring them all together to see useful data. So one thing we've been looking at is with the introduction recently of, well, I say recently, but everywhere you look now, there's some form of AI and everyone's working on automation. There are tools now that can help you bring all that data in, like we do we have a platform called LocalGov Flows, and it takes all of the data sources that you can see on the left-hand side here. It then allows us to use agentic AI to set rules and parameters. So we have an agent who coordinates the flow. We can have an agent that normalizes the data and takes into consideration the KPI rules that we set, like that scoring matrix you saw earlier. It can apply the scores for us. Then it has, like I said, the KPI scoring and insights, and then out of that you get an output. And in terms of kind of what the output could look like, you could have it as something like this. So a website KPI dashboard, which is really easy to access. And you can see things on the screen like what was the data at benchmark, which is when we've done the user research at the very beginning of the project. What is the target? How did we do this month? How did we compare against the last period, which is either monthly or quarterly? And then it can tell you whether you're on track, whether you're needs attention. And typically what we do here is, as a continuous improvement plan with our customers, if a KPI is significantly reduced, something's changed on the website, or if it's got significantly worse, then we'd go in to that specific area and we'd look and see if there's new content been added. Has there been a change to the navigation? Is there an accessibility flaw? And from there, we have the ability to put together a plan with the customer to address the issue that's occurred. But without a dashboard, without easy access to a website KPI dashboard, we wouldn't know that issue occurred. But more importantly, we can't demonstrate month on month that we made the right choice by designing and building the website in that way. The navigation's easy to use. So having this at your fingertips is what I think is critical for most councils, which is what we see missing quite a lot. And that is everything from us.
Thank you both.
Tim.
Oh, maybe me.
Yeah.
That is amazing. Thank you so much. Loads and loads of things to think about. I'm wondering if anyone's got any questions. It's kind of the end of the day, and the end of the week, so maybe people are flagging a little. If you've got any questions, please put them in the chat. I've got one, which was about when will we receive the presentation? Yes, absolutely, you will. We will send. I think Jamie and Nichole, you'll share the presentation with us, and then we'll send it out to everybody. Likewise, the video of this. Already, there's some videos from earlier in the week that are on YouTube if you choose to go and have a look. My question was about how you use these KPIs, or how you have a conversation with a service owner about them, and whether you found service owners in councils become more engaged when you've got this kind of material to show them. You know, it can be a problem. How do you find that relationship works? Does this get folks interested, get them focused?
I think what we find initially, the hardest thing we find is driving adoption from the beginning with service leads, because the website redevelopment is usually driven by either a core website team or a core digital team. And when we're trying to get stakeholders involved to say, look, we need to understand what the challenges are in your area, they just don't see it as a priority. When you get that one SME that is really interested and engaged, and you're able to get a result from a KPI like Nichole's shown, then you take that to another SME in council tax or in housing and say, look, this is what someone else has achieved. Here's what we can help you with. That's usually when we get the uptake. So usually we have to provide evidence to get them on board, which is why we usually focus on public beta combines two things: the areas from the data and the research that we find are failing most, but also the most engaged SMEs, which then help us drive adoption for the rest of the project. And what you usually see is when you get to if we do a private beta and a public beta phase, by the time we get to public beta, we usually got a few more SMEs that are, oh, they're doing it great over there now, let's jump on board. So that's typically, I think it's probably the same for everyone. Getting SMEs involved from the very beginning is quite hard until you can demonstrate the narrative that this is important for everyone.
I've definitely found that in my exploits. I'm looking if there's any more questions. Simon made a point earlier that if a user journey, do you want to make your point, Simon? I don't know if you feel like coming on camera, or I can do that for you.
Hello.
Hi. Do you want to make your point? You were talking earlier about eligibility related
eligibility. Yeah, it's just that thing that yeah, sometimes if we're actually seeing a drop off, then that can be a good thing. If the user has come in to apply for a long and complicated process, if the user journey has been constructed in such a way that they can find out very quickly that no, it's not worth my while going through this long form, then that is a success. That drop off is a success.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's why we always advise not to measure drop-off rates or bounce rates, because for that exact reason, you may have really clear guidance on a form that stops someone from submitting it, which is why we switched to KPI to correctly submitted forms with the right app. So we measure two things: whether forms are submitted with the right information and whether forms are incorrectly submitted because you're not eligible. But yeah, you're completely right, Simon. It's a positive metric rather than a negative. Nichole, sorry, did you have anything to add there?
Yeah, it's a really great point, and it's another it's a good reminder to look at everything kind of holistically. Like, that's why it's so important to be working really closely, if you can, with your service leads, because they understand the ins and outs of these forms and these user journeys, and kind of combining that with user testing as well. I think it helps really see kind of the overall journey and make sure that you're setting KPIs that make sense.
Thanks both. Just a quick one from Darren. If you're visualizing web analytics, do you prefer Power BI or Google Looker Studio? Do you have a preference, or do you use bits of both?
Well, typically it's wherever the customer has, which is 9 times out of 10 is Power BI with their Microsoft license. We've done a combination, so we've used Google Looker as well. We've also created React interfaces that we can put on top of PHP, and essentially that's what I meant earlier by some of our central government Drupal projects are Drupal, but we create a React interface on the front that pulls in all the data and allows them to log into their Drupal service and access it there. So really it comes down to preference. But for example, we could easily have like a screen in the React on an LGD backend page for admins to go in and easily access everything from one platform rather than logging into Power BI, etc., which you can then share with SLT, or you can create a downloadable version, not a PDF. We advise against PDFs. We're very accessible friendly. But yeah, it can be done either way. But Power BI is usually the easiest.
Big thumbs up for not a PDF. I think everybody would agree with that. Or you can like fax it to somebody and get it like that would be really old school and useful as well. So let's definitely not do that. I think we're at time. So unless there's any more questions, Nichole, Jamie, thank you so much for coming and sort of sharing your pearls of wisdom with us. Thanks for your questions and comments. We hope you found this useful. We will email everybody a link to the deck and the video when it's released. Quick thanks to our sponsors, Agile Collective, Anatech, Big Blue Door. I would say there's more new sessions this week, but there aren't. This is the last one. So thank you so much for coming to the graveyard shift. We've really enjoyed it. It's been exhausting, but a really good week, and I hope you've all enjoyed it too. We will do another one of these next year. Tim, I don't know if you want to say, is there anything we want to big up?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. You noticed me turning on my camera. We're doing an event with Jamie and the good people of Woking Council very soon, December the 4th in Woking, a Connect event. If you would like to come along, please do jump on our Luma account and register. I should have put the
yeah, I should have put that on.
But I was not quite quick enough to do that. But please head over to the Luma account and do that now.
And we may well do Xmas drinks as well, so watch out for that. And we'll do more Connect events next year and a big LocalGov Drupal camp next year as well. So there's loads of stuff coming up. But between then and now, come to our community events, have a really good sort of run up to Christmas, and we will see you again very soon.